It's late. Whatever you should be doing, it can wait. You found the graveyard slot, stories for the hours nobody claims. It's just us now. Tonight's story, the Coldwater Lease. It arrived the way they all do. A padded envelope, no return name, postmarked out of the Texas Hill Country. We read them as written. Let's begin. There's a photograph of the back of my own head, taken tonight from inside my own kitchen. For 5 months, a man paid me $60 at a time to review the photographs he was taking of my life, and to tell him, in my own handwriting, that I never saw a thing. I signed every report. Let me explain. I review trail camera footage for a living. Mostly it's deer. I say that up front because of how the rest of this sounds. A man mails me an SD card in a padded envelope, and I sit at my kitchen table at 11 at night in a shirt I've been wearing since Tuesday and tell him whether his property had activity on it that week. It's a joke of a job. It's also the job I had when I found out what had actually been going on for 5 months, and by then I'd already signed off on all of it. The part I can't get past, not that something was watching me, that I was the one who cleared it every time in my own handwriting. Here's the texture of the work, if you want it. Hunting leases all over the Texas Hill Country run trail cams on their acreage. Cheap Bushnells and Moultries zip-tied to fence posts and old oak trunks. Motion-triggered infrared flash, running on 8 AA batteries that last about 6 weeks if the cold doesn't kill them first. The lease manager's got no interest in spending his evenings squinting through a week of triggers just to log a card, so he pulls it, drops it in a stamped envelope, and mails it to a P.O. box in Kerrville that forwards to my house. I run it through sorting software that bins the motion triggers into a contact sheet, and I watch buck, doe, hog, empty frame triggered by a blowing branch, buck again. The software has 4 bins. After 2 years, so did I. I write a 1-page report, species counted, best buck score estimate, peak activity windows, sometimes a note like camera angle drifted, recommend repositioning. $11 a card. 25 cards a week if I keep after it, which by this spring I mostly wasn't. It's not a career. It's what I landed in after I got let go from a systems admin job in San Antonio. Officially restructuring. Actually because I'd started no call no showing on Mondays after Renata left, which is its own story and not one I come out of looking good in. I moved to a rental outside Junction because the rent was 1/3 of what I'd been paying in the city, brought my dog Skillet and about half my furniture, and found this job on a hunting forum through a guy in Ozona who was aging out of it. His eyes were going and he couldn't tell a shadow from a hog anymore at 2 a.m. He trained me over the phone in about 40 minutes. That was the entire vetting process for a business that, as it turned out, someone was eventually going to use as a blind. Nobody has ever asked me for a license or a background check to look at pictures of deer. I want that on the record before I tell you about Coldwater, because what happened to me only happened on account of exactly how uncareful I'd let myself get, and I'd like to think I'm not that man anymore, even though it's a little late to matter. My sister Dana calls me most Sundays. I bring this up now because she is the reason I know exactly which Sunday everything started, and because there were several points in this story where I could have told her, or somebody, what was going on and didn't, and I think if I'm going to tell you the rest of it honestly, I have to tell you that part too, as it happens. Coldwater Lease showed up in my mailbox for the first time in February, the week after one of those Sunday calls. No return name on the envelope, just a P.O. box in Junction and a note in blue ballpoint. Please log all activity. Payment enclosed. Payment enclosed was $60, folded into a tight little square the size of a matchbook. $60 for $11 of work. I remember showing it to Dana on our next call, joking that I'd found a rich idiot. I ran the card that same night. A game trail along a fence line. A decent 8-point moving through around dusk a few times, a couple of hogs rooting near what looked like an old stock tank. I wrote it up, mailed the report and the card back to the P.O. box like the note asked, and by the time the next Coldwater envelope came, 3 weeks later, same $60 folded the same tight way, I'd already filed the first one under easy money and stopped thinking about it as anything else. After that, it settled into a rhythm, roughly monthly. And I did to Coldwater what I'd started doing to most of my regulars by then, which is the thing I'm least proud of in this whole story. I let the software auto-sort the triggers into thumbnails. I scanned the sheet for anything that wasn't obviously a deer or empty brush, and if nothing jumped out at a glance, I wrote light activity, several doe and one immature buck, no notable specimens, and moved on to the next card in the stack. Renata used to say I had a talent for looking at things without seeing them, back when she still bothered saying things like that to me. She was talking about our marriage. Turns out it also described my entire professional skill set. Nobody had ever complained about a report that said nothing had happened. Nobody complains about the absence of a problem. I started numbering the Coldwater cards myself in blue Sharpie on the plastic, starting around card 6, mostly so I could track whether the buck I'd cataloged in April was still alive come summer. It's a habit from the job. Half of what I do is just bookkeeping with antlers. The thing about card 14 is that it kept coming back. I don't mean the same footage showed up on a new card. I mean the same card, the actual piece of plastic with my Sharpie 14 on it, mailed to me 5 separate times inside of 3 weeks, each time with the same 41 motion triggers. Each time with a clip at what the timestamp called roughly 3 in the morning of a heavy-bodied buck standing broadside at the edge of frame for about 40 seconds before it startled and bolted. Good clip, first time through. I put a still frame in the report because a client who pays $60 a card seemed like a man who'd want a photo for his wall eventually. 3 days later, the same card came back in an identical envelope. I figured he pulled it a second time without buying a replacement, which happens. A landowner just resends the card he's got, and you end up reviewing a week of overlap. I ran it again. 41 triggers. The buck at the edge of frame, same pose, same 40 seconds, frame for frame as best I could tell. Except the burned-in timestamp read 341 instead of 314, and cheap trail cams have flaky internal clocks. Batteries drain and the clock drifts. So I wrote duplicate card, recommend swap, charged him half rate, and mailed it back with a post-it telling him to buy a fresh card next time he wrote. He didn't buy a fresh card. Card 14 came a third time. Buck at the edge of frame, 40 seconds, timestamp 2:58 this go-round, and I only caught the next part because I was annoyed enough by then to actually look instead of skim. The tree shadow on the ground behind the deer had rotated maybe 15 degrees between one supposed 3 a.m. and the next, more than the moon could account for in the 20-some minutes the timestamps claimed separated them. Like whoever set the clock had also had to decide, each time, how much time to pretend had passed. By the 4th trip through my mailbox, I'd stopped being annoyed in the ordinary sense, and started being annoyed the way you get with a word you've said so many times it quit sounding like English. Same envelope, same handwriting on the address, same 41 triggers, and I found myself doing something I don't do for any other client on earth. I laid 3 of the printed still frames side by side on my kitchen table like a hand of solitaire, buck and tree line and the dark smear of brush behind it, hunting for the tell. This time it was a branch. A skinny mesquite switch, maybe 2 feet long, hanging into the top right corner of frame in the second and third cards, absent in the first and fourth. Wind could take a branch like that down and it wouldn't be strange on its own. What was strange was that in the 5th card, it was back, in almost the same position, like somebody had picked it back up off the ground and rehung it because they'd noticed on review that it was supposed to be there. Not grown back. Put back. The 5th time card 14 came back, I noticed the buck's near ear. In cards 1 and 4, it sat up sharp, swiveled toward something out of frame to the animal's left. In cards 2, 3, and 5, it lay flatter, more relaxed, aimed forward. 4 seconds of ear position, and I built a private taxonomy for it before I caught myself doing it. I'd started a column in my notebook, unprompted, unpaid, labeled ear. Like I was grading the same essay 5 times for a teacher who kept insisting I hadn't read it closely enough. That's the night I understood the annoyance had turned into something with its hooks and deeper, because a normal man does not keep a column in a notebook labeled ear. A normal man swaps the card and moves on. I didn't swap the card. I watched all 5, back to back, twice, with a legal pad open next to the keyboard, hunting for the one clean tell that would let me write equipment malfunction. Please replace unit and be done being curious about a man who'd never once given me a name. That's the night I sat down and watched the whole card front to back at full attention instead of skimming the contact sheet, which took about 40 minutes I didn't have to spare. I want to tell you I did it because something in me already knew. I didn't. I did it because I was annoyed and a little fascinated. The specific mean curiosity you get when a restaurant check doesn't add up, and you keep re-adding it out of spite rather than just paying the extra $4 and going home. Trigger 9 wasn't the butt clip. It was an earlier one logged at 11:52 p.m., camera firing on what I'd written up every time as a false trigger. Empty game trail. 4 seconds of grass in the dark, wind probably. Brush blowing across the sensor. On my 4th pass through it, 4 in the morning by then. Eyes gone dry and swimmy from the screen. I saw it in the bottom left corner, low to the ground at the base of the post. The camera was zip-tied to a hand. Pale in the infrared wash. Fingers spread against the bark like someone crouched below the camera's downward field of view was steadying themselves to stand up. I ran it back, paused it. Zoomed until the pixels dissolved into soup, and it could have been a knot of wood. Could have been my own tired eyes doing the thing. Tired eyes do at 4 in the morning, but I'd seen it clean for 1 full frame before I zoomed in and ruined it and clean. It was a hand. I went back through my old files. I keep every contact sheet I've ever generated in a folder tree by lease name and month, which is the one genuinely organized thing about how I run this business, a leftover habit from the systems admin job that I've never let go of. I pulled Coldwater February through April, and this time I made myself actually look, not skim, at every trigger I'd waved off as false, brush or false, wind or, in one memorable case, false insect on lens. 11 of them, spread across 3 months, had the same low pale shape tucked into some corner of frame. Once it was a shoulder, foreshortened, ducking out of frame just as the shutter caught it. Once, unmistakably. Once I knew to look for it, an ear and the side of a jaw, tilted up at the camera from below, like someone examining the housing from underneath to see how it worked. Once you know a person is in a photograph, you can't ever see the empty picture again. Someone had been visiting that camera for 3 months, not hunting it, tending it. And in every report I'd filed on it, $60 a month, no name, P.O. box, I had told the client his land showed light deer activity and nothing else worth mentioning. I want to tell you what that did to the rest of my week because it wasn't nothing, and because it's the first place the cost of all this landed on somebody other than me. I had 6 other cards stacked on my kitchen table that same week. Real clients, a rancher outside Rock Springs who'd paid extra for a rush turnaround because he was deciding whether to sell timber rights before a hard freeze. I ran his card the way I'd been running everything for 2 years, half attention, thumbnails blurring past while some other part of my head kept walking the Coldwater footage in the loop, and I missed a bear. Not a deer, not a hog. A black bear, a young boar by the look of him, ambling through a game trail at dusk. The kind of sighting a landowner in that county would want called out in bold at the top of the page. Maybe reported to Parks and Wildlife. Certainly not buried under a line that red light activity. Nothing notable. I caught my own mistake 2 days later doing something I never do, which is rereading a report after I've already mailed it, and by then the rancher had already made his decision about the timber without knowing there was a bear denning distance from where the crews would be cutting. I called and told him. He was decent about it, said no harm done probably, but I heard the recalculation in his voice, the small downward adjustment a man makes about how much he trusts you once he's caught you not looking. I built 2 years of business on the promise that I looked so my clients didn't have to, and here I was, missing an actual bear because I couldn't stop turning over a card nobody had asked me to obsess about. I didn't call Dan and tell her that either. It didn't seem to belong to the same story yet. I know better now. I didn't call Dana that week even though it was a Sunday, even though she asked twice why I sounded off and I told her allergies. I won't flag that here because it's the first of several times I could have said something to somebody and didn't, and I mean to keep an honest count as I go. The first person I actually did call was the man who'd sold me the business, which tells you something about the order of my priorities that week, though it took me a while to see it that way. His name is Gerald Fikes, and he lives outside Ozona in a double wide with a carport full of deer feeders he never got around to selling off. I hadn't talked to him in over a year, not since he walked me through the software and the client list over the phone that one long evening and wished me luck and hung up. And calling him now felt a little like calling an ex-landlord about a stain you just noticed in the carpet. Awkward, overdue, and probably not going to fix anything. I told him it was good to hear his voice, which was true, and then I told him about Coldwater. The name didn't seem to mean anything to him at first, and I described it in the flattest terms I could manage. A card that keeps circling back with the same 40 seconds of buck on it, a landowner I'd never spoken to, folded cash instead of a check. I didn't mention the hand. I don't fully know why I didn't. I think some part of me was testing whether he'd already know, and didn't want to hand him the detail that would make it easy to fake. He got quiet in a way that had weight to it. The particular quiet of a man deciding how much of the truth is worth the trouble of saying out loud. Coldwater, he said, like he was turning the word over to check the underside of it. That one's not mine. I mean, it wasn't ever really mine to give you. That account was already on the books when I bought the client list off the fella before me. Must be 9-10 years back now. I just kept forwarding the mail same as everybody else's. I asked him who the fella before him was, and he said he honestly couldn't remember. Some old boy up around Sonora, dead now, he thought, and that Coldwater had always been like that. $60, no name, no phone number, easy and a little odd and never worth chasing down because it never caused a lick of trouble. Paid better than anybody and asked less than anybody, he said. You don't look a gift horse. I asked him straight out if he'd ever seen anything strange in the footage. There was a pause I didn't like the length of, and then he said, "Well, hell, son, my eyes weren't what they used to be there toward the end. Doc kept telling me I needed the cataract surgery, and I kept telling him I'd get to it. Half of what I sent back the last couple years I was squinting at a bright blur and calling it a deer because it usually was." He laughed the short, embarrassed laugh of a man owning up to a flaw that costs him nothing to admit now. You probably do a sight better job of it than I did there at the end, if I'm honest. If it had 4 legs, I called it a deer. If it didn't, I called it brush. I was about half blind and still charging full rate. Ain't that a thing to confess to a man? He seemed almost pleased to say it, like it was the harmless kind of secret, the kind you tell to get a laugh rather than the kind you're hiding. I asked him if Coldwater had ever done anything like this while it was his. Cards that came back, timestamps that didn't sit right. He thought about it and said no, not that he recalled, but then added, almost as an afterthought, in a voice gone a little strange, "Come to think of it, there for a stretch, right before I sold up to you, that account got real quiet. Months of nothing coming in the mail at all. I figured the fella had finally sold the land or died himself. Whether it'd ever come back after that, well, that'd be your mailbox to know, not mine." He said it like a piece of trivia, a mildly interesting gap in an otherwise unremarkable ledger, and moved on to ask me how Skillet was doing, whether I'd started hunting my own lease yet like I'd talked about. I let him change the subject because that's a habit of mine too, apparently. Not just with my own silences, but with other men's. I didn't understand what he told me until much later, lying awake doing the arithmetic on it, that the account had gone dark exactly when his eyes did, sat idle through the handoff, and picked back up only once it had watched me long enough to be sure I would run this business exactly the incurious way he had. At the time on the phone, it just sounded like an old man's ordinary story about a life easing itself toward blindness. Nothing sinister in it, no warning offered because he didn't know he was carrying one. I thanked him, told him to get the cataract surgery already, and he laughed again and said he would, one of these days, and we hung up having talked for 20 minutes about a thing that would take me another week to understand was the most important 20 minutes of the whole business relationship. He wasn't ominous. He was just an old man telling me, without meaning to, that he'd been the wrong kind of careless in exactly the shape this thing was built to use, right up until it needed someone new to be careless in his place. Coldwater hadn't inherited me by accident. It had been waiting for me. A smarter man calls someone at this point. I didn't, and I want to walk through why, because it matters for what came after. I didn't call the sheriff because I didn't technically have anything to report. A hand in a trail cam frame on private land isn't a crime. For all I knew, it was the landowner himself, checking his own equipment at midnight because he worked nights same as half the county does. I also didn't call because explaining the situation would mean explaining that I run an unlicensed wildlife data business out of my kitchen for cash from strangers who mail me P.O. boxes instead of names, none of which is illegal, all of which is the kind of thing that makes a deputy look at you a certain way. And I'd already had one professional near miss with people in authority looking at me a certain way. And underneath both of those reasons, if I'm honest, was the plainer one. Coldwater was still the easiest $60 I made all month, and some animal, hindbrain part of me did the math and decided a mildly creepy trail cam was a cheap price to keep collecting it. So I did the thing I actually know how to do. I went and looked at the land myself, which in 2 years of doing this job I had never once done for any client, because the whole premise of the business is that people pay you instead of driving out there themselves. But I had the P.O. box, and a small-town postal clerk will tell you the physical address behind a box if you frame the question right, which, for me, took one lie about a misdelivered package and about 4 minutes of a Tuesday afternoon. The address on file belonged to a man named Otis Krieger. The county appraisal map showed Krieger owning 200 acres off a farm-to-market road I recognized, because it dead ends about half a mile from my own rental, on the far side of a cedar break I'd walked skillet through a dozen times without ever seeing a fence line, or a no trespassing sign to tell me it belonged to anybody. I drove out on a Sunday, didn't call Dana that day either, that's two, told myself I'd catch her Wednesday, with an excuse loaded in case anyone asked what I was doing. Camera malfunction. Thought I'd swing by and reposition it, no charge. Nobody asked. There was no gate. No lease sign, no feeder, no blind, none of the furniture that comes standard with an actual working hunting lease. Just cedar and rock and one trail camera zip-tied to a post exactly where the file's embedded GPS coordinates said it should be. Except the coordinates were wrong. Not badly. Off by about 0.4 of a mile. Which I only caught because I'd pulled the numbers up on my phone before I got out of the truck. And the blue dot didn't sit where I expected once I was standing there. 0.4 of a mile in the direction of the cedar break. In the direction once I stood at the camera and sighted along the angle it was actually mounted rather than the angle its own housing implied of my house. I walked it. 11 minutes at a normal pace, no trail, brush snagging my jeans the whole way, and it came out behind my own back fence at the tree line. I look at every night from my kitchen table while I'm reviewing somebody else's deer for somebody else's money. I told myself that was enough for one Sunday, and it wasn't, and I went back out after dark anyway, which I haven't told anybody until now, because it was a genuinely stupid thing to do, and I knew it while I was doing it. No flashlight, because a flashlight is a way of telling something in the dark exactly where you are. Just the porch light behind me and my eyes adjusting the slow, grudging way. Eyes adjusting the slow, grudging way eyes adjust when there's no moon to help them. I stood at my own back fence, the slack top wire cold under my hand, and looked out at the cedar break. The way I'd looked out at it, 1,000 nights running somebody else's numbers, except this time I made myself actually search it, square yard by square yard, for the camera housing I now knew was in there. I never found it with my eyes. What I found instead, close to the fence, in dirt still soft from a rain 2 days back, was a single boot print, toe pointed at my house, deep enough on the heel that whoever left it had been standing there a while rather than passing through. My own boots were a size 10.5. This one dwarfed the yardstick I fetched from the shed without thinking too hard about why I owned a yardstick and knew exactly where it was in the dark. I didn't sleep with the lights off that night, and I told myself in the morning it was for Skillet's sake, in case he needed to see his water bowl, which is the kind of lie you can only tell yourself successfully at 7 in the morning with the sun already up, and the fear of the night before starting to feel embarrassing rather than earned. Wednesday came and I didn't call Dana. Instead, Dana called me, heard something in my voice she didn't like the sound of, and by Friday evening her truck was coming up my caliche driveway trailing dust with no warning ahead of it at all. She got out already talking, already halfway into a sentence about how I'd sounded on the phone like something was chewing on me, and she wasn't going to sit 2 hours away in Kerrville wondering about it when she could just drive out and look at my face and decide for herself. She'd brought a crock pot of something with cumin in it, riding in a towel on the passenger seat because Dana does not show up empty-handed to a welfare check, and she set it going on my stove like she owned the kitchen, which by the rules that govern siblings she more or less does. That's 3, though it took a different shape than the first 2. Not a call I failed to make, but a woman who drove out to give me the chance in person, close enough to reach across the table and take my hand if I'd let the sentence out. And I still didn't let it out. It was, if I take the whole miserable spring in aggregate, the best evening I had in it. She ate at my table and needled me the whole time, asked why there were 3 identical manila folders labeled Coldwater stacked at my elbow like I was building a shrine, asked when was the last time I'd washed the shirt I had on, asked more seriously whether I'd talked to anybody since Renata, meaning a person with a license to listen for a living, not meaning her, though she'd have settled for being the person if I'd let her. She had a way of circling the question 3 times before she asked it straight, and by the 3rd circle that night she'd landed close enough to it that I felt something give in my chest, a specific, familiar loosening like a knot deciding whether it wants to be undone. Skillet lay across both our feet under the table the whole meal, working a rawhide she brought him without me asking. And for about 40 minutes, I let myself believe I was just a man having dinner with his sister. I almost told her, I want that on the record too, since I'm keeping one. She asked, straight out this time, no more circling, what Coldwater was, because she'd caught the name off one of the folders, and something in my face when I answered told her it wasn't nothing. I opened my mouth with an actual true sentence lined up behind my teeth. There's a camera pointed at our fence line, and I don't know whose it is. And what came out instead was that it was just a difficult client, cheap and demanding, the kind that makes you dread the mailbox. She let it go because I asked her, with my eyes if not my mouth, the way you can with a sister who's known you her whole life, and has decided for that one evening to let you have the mercy of not saying it. She left Saturday morning with the crock pot washed and dried on my counter and a promise extracted and given easily because I meant it in the moment, that I'd call her Sunday like always. I've turned that dinner over more than any other hour of this whole spring. The one time somebody drove 2 hours to sit across from me and hand me every opening in the world, and I still couldn't make the words come. I didn't handle what came next well. That Saturday night, alone again with the quiet I'd just spent an evening pretending didn't have teeth, I didn't sleep, and I called the number on the $60 notes, except there had never been a number. Only ballpoint on a P.O. box. I sat there at 2 a.m. realizing that in 5 months of a supposed client relationship, I had never once heard Otis Krager's voice, never seen a face, never gotten so much as an email address. Only folded cash and instructions, mailed to a man whose entire professional identity is built around not looking too closely at what's put in front of him. I drove to the county courthouse Monday morning instead of the sheriff's office, because I still couldn't make myself say the actual sentence out loud to a cop, and I pulled everything the clerk would give me on Otis Krieger. The 200 acres were real, the taxes current, paid by check drawn on an account whose routing prefix, a friend from the old San Antonio job, more patient with a phone than sense would allow, looked it up for me as a favor, traced to a business address that turned out to be a up-store mailbox 2 counties over. There's no Otis Krager in the state voter file, none in the DMV records that same friend peeked at off the books. None in 30 years of county obituaries, for a man who'd have to be pushing 60 at least to have owned that land as long as the deed said he had. There is a name on a piece of paper and a stack of my own reports mailed dutifully back to a box, 5 months of paperwork with my letterhead on it, certifying month after month that nothing worth mentioning was happening on that acreage. I was alone in the records room by then, everyone else gone to lunch, and I heard a page turn behind me, soft and deliberate, the way you turn a page when you're actually reading it. I looked. There was no one there, and the binder on the far table was closed. The clerk who pulled the deed for me, an older woman named Mrs. Ostrander, who I'd gone to high school a grade behind, made a small noise over the paperwork before I even asked my next question. The kind of noise a person makes when a familiar task turns up something that doesn't sit right. Then she told me the deed transfer 9 years back had been notarized by a stamp number that, best she could find, had never been issued to anybody at all. Not lost, not expired. Never real to begin with, the same way the man whose land it now supposedly was had never been real to begin with. She couldn't tell me what that meant, procedurally, for a filing that had sat unquestioned in the county's own records for almost a decade. Neither could I. I wrote it down anyway, the way you write down a receipt total you don't understand, because some habits don't turn off just because the stakes changed. The friend from San Antonio, his name's Terrence, we used to eat lunch together at a takery off 410 before I got fired, and he didn't, is the kind of man who still uses a paper day planner in a department that issued him 3 different scheduling apps. He has, in the 11 years I've known him, never once let a call go to voicemail during business hours, which is its own quiet kind of loyalty if you think about it long enough. He called me back with the routing information, sounding almost proud of himself, and then went quiet on the line for a second when I asked him to also check whether Krieger held any other property anywhere in the state. He came back a few minutes later and said no, nothing, not so much as a storage unit. And then he asked me, not joking, if everything was okay, if I wanted him to come out. I told him it was fine. I told him it was probably just some rich old man's tax dodge, a shell for hunting rights he'd sell off eventually. And Terrence, who was a better friend than I've been to anyone in years, said okay in the voice of a man who didn't believe me and was choosing not to push. He'd done this before, I realized once I hung up. Gone quiet and let me have my lie. Back when I was disappearing from my own life, after Renata left and he was the only one from the old office who kept calling anyway, week after week, long after it would have been easier for him to write me off as somebody who didn't want to be found. It occurred to me, a little late, that I had spent years training the people who loved me to stop pushing, the same way I'd trained myself to stop looking, and that both of those educations had been taught by the same teacher. That's 4, by my count, where I had a chance to say the actual words out loud to somebody who would have believed me, and chose the smaller, more manageable lie instead. I understood it sitting in my truck in the courthouse parking lot with the AC dying and sweat sticking my shirt to the vinyl seat. Nobody had ever intended to hunt that lease. Somebody had needed a camera pointed at the tree line behind my house for 5 months. Pictures of my land, my dog, my porch light cycling on and off, my truck coming and going. And they'd needed a legitimate, boring, paper-trailed reason for that camera to exist, so that if anyone ever asked, there was a wildlife survey on file, filed monthly, signed by a real local business describing light deer activity and nothing more. They didn't need to hide the camera from me. They needed the man reviewing its footage to be exactly the kind of tired, incurious, quota-driven professional who processes 41 triggers a card and files the parts that don't fit into buck or hog underbrush, wind, bug on the lens. I was the camouflage. They needed me specifically, not despite how I do this job, because of it. And now I understood too that they hadn't needed to find that man. They'd inherited him and watched him through the better part of 2 quiet years to be sure the inheritance held, and started up again only once they were satisfied it did. I drove home from the courthouse and did the one practical thing I could think to do, which was dig out a box cutter from a kitchen drawer and go around the house checking window latches I hadn't touched since I moved in, half of them painted shut, one of them in the back bedroom sliding open so easily under my hand, that I stood there a long moment just feeling stupid about how long it had been unlocked without my noticing. I found an old motion sensor porch light in the same drawer, a leftover from some previous tenant's Christmas box, and screwed it in over the back door with a screwdriver I had to borrow from my own truck because I couldn't remember owning one. It worked for exactly one night. It caught a possum at 10, a low branch swaying at midnight, and by 2 in the morning I'd unplugged it myself. Because the 3rd time it snapped on, I came up off the couch with my heart going like a fist on a door, and I decided, in the specific bad logic of a man who hasn't slept in 3 days, that not knowing was going to be easier on me than knowing every single time the wind moved something. I want to be honest that I understood exactly what I was doing when I unplugged it. It was the same decision I'd been making for 2 years on every card that came through my mailbox, just smaller and faster and done with my own hand instead of a pen. I was choosing the version of the night where nothing was proven, because the version where something was proven was a version I didn't know how to live inside of yet. I didn't sleep that whole week. I should have packed up Skillet and left. And I want to tell you, I at least thought about it seriously, and I did for about an hour before I talked myself back down to where I actually went, which was back to my desk. Back to every Coldwater file since February, watching each one again start to finish, full attention this time for the first time since I'd taken the account. It's slow work, watching like that. 41 triggers a card, 5 cards, and each one wants to be skimmed the way I've trained myself to skim everything for 2 years. Eyes catching motion, brain filling in deer or nothing before the frames even settled. And I had to keep stopping myself, rewinding, forcing my eyes to walk the whole rectangle of the image, instead of just the middle where the action usually sits. My kitchen got cold around 2 in the morning and I didn't get up to fix the thermostat. Skillet came and put his chin on my knee at one point, the way he does when I've been sitting too still for too long. And I remember petting him with one hand and not looking away from the screen with the other, which tells you plainly enough which one of us I was choosing. February's card gave up the hand first, the one I'd already found, but watching it again in sequence rather than as an isolated frame, I clocked its position properly for the first time. The base of a post at the property's east corner, near half a mile from my fence, about as far from my house as that acreage gets. Whoever it was had started as far away as the land allowed, like a man easing into cold water a step at a time, checking whether anyone would notice before he committed to it. I noted the coordinates in the margin the way I'd note a buck's core range, out of habit, before I understood I was building a map of something closing in on me one card at a time. My February report, the one I'd mailed back with the $60 I hadn't earned, ran a single line, light early season activity. Expect improvement as weather cools. I'd written that sentence before I'd finished my coffee. I read it again in June with the hand still glowing pale on my monitor, and understood it as the first brick in a wall I built myself. One incurious sentence, a month. 5 months running. March showed the shoulder and part of a torso, and this time watching in sequence I caught something I'd missed cold the first time through. The camera position itself had moved. Not the frame within the housing, the housing. My own notes from that month, written in my own hand, read camera angle drifted. Landowner may have repositioned, no action needed. I had written that sentence the way I write 100 sentences a month. A reflex excuse standing in for a question I never thought to ask, which was why would a man with 200 acres and one trail camera walk 200 yards to move it 6 feet? April gave me the ear and the jaw, tilted up into the lens from below. April was also the month I finally sat with the plat map open next to the monitor and did the measuring properly instead of eyeballing it. 11 yards from my own back fence, the run of it with the top wire gone slack. The one Skillet's been able to nose under since spring, and that I keep meaning to fix and haven't. 11 yards. Close enough that whoever crouched there could have heard my television through an open window if the wind sat right. May's card, which I'd filed at the time under light activity, no notable specimens in 11 words, I am not proud of, gave up a frame at trigger 31 that I'd cataloged as a false trigger, brush. A full torso this time, not foreshortened, not ducking away in time, standing upright at the very edge of frame with its back to the lens. Close enough and lit well enough by the infrared flash that I could make out a jacket collar and the pale line of a neck above it. No crouch, no hurry, no glance back at a camera he had to know was there. Whoever this was had stopped bothering to hide from a lens he owned as surely as I owned my own signature. May was the month they stood up. June's card, the most recent one before card 15, put the shape inside the tree line itself rather than at its edge, not approaching the boundary anymore but past it, a silhouette between 2 old oaks on what any surveyor would call my side of the fence, facing the house. I had written on our report, deer activity light this cycle, recommend camera relocation for better coverage, which I read back to myself out loud, alone, at 3 in the morning, and had to stop and put my head down on the table for a minute, because I understood I had, in my own handwriting, recommended he move the camera closer. Laid end to end and put in order, the shapes I'd dismissed for 5 months describe a path, month by month, each one closer than the last, each one bolder than the last, and each one accepted by me without comment, filed under the vocabulary I'd built for exactly this purpose: brush, wind, drift, relocation. Words I'd have sworn under oath were about deer. Card 14, the one that wouldn't stop coming back. I understand now for what it actually was. Not a malfunction, not an accidental remailing. The same 40 seconds of the most normal-looking, least alarming footage on the entire card, sent back to me 5 times because someone wanted to know how many times I'd watch it before I actually watched it, how many timestamp glitches and rehung branches and repositioned ears I'd wave off before curiosity or boredom finally won out over the discipline of not looking. The buck was bait. I was the one being tested, not the camera. Same as Gerald had been measured before me, though I didn't let myself finish that thought all the way through until later, lying in the dark, doing the arithmetic on an old man's laugh over the phone. I'd like to say I failed that test on principle, out of some late-blooming diligence. Really, I failed it out of spite, over $4 I thought a check owed me. I don't think the reason matters to whoever was watching to see if I would. It was somewhere in that same past or the archive, close to dawn, eyes burning, that I pulled May's card back up a second time for a detail I thought I'd misread, and found something I hadn't been looking for at all. Trigger 6 on that card was one I'd cleared without a second thought the first time. A wide shot, most of the frame taken up by brush in the corner of the cedar break. Nothing in it I'd have called notable. In the bottom right corner, half out of frame, sat the tailgate and back bumper of a truck that wasn't mine. Same primer patch over the rear wheel well she's been meaning to paint for 2 years. Same Kerrville County Fair sticker peeling off the bumper. The timestamp read the Friday evening she'd shown up unannounced with the crockpot, minutes, not hours, before she came up my drive. Her truck caught through the one gap in the cedar where the brake lines up with the bend in the county road. The camera had caught her on the road in, which meant the camera saw the road in, which meant every visit, every mail day, every evening my porch light cycled on had been going into somebody's archive alongside the deer. Whoever was behind that camera hadn't only been documenting me. He'd been documenting who came to see me and when, and I sat there at the kitchen table with my sister's truck lit up in infrared on my screen and understood that the quiet I'd been keeping from her hadn't kept her out of this at all. It had just kept her from knowing she was already in it. I called Dana Thursday night. I actually dialed, let it ring twice, and hung up before she picked up because I still didn't have a sentence that didn't sound insane out loud, and because some old married habit in me still reflexively protects people I love from problems I've caused myself by not paying attention. That's 5, and the last one. And I bring it up because I think if I had let it ring a third time, this would be a different kind of story. The kind where somebody else knows where to start looking. Card 15 came Friday. Same envelope, same $60 folded into the same tight square. No note this time, which should have told me something on its own. 5 months of the same 3 words in blue ballpoint, and then silence, like a man who's finished saying what he needed to say. I ran it at my kitchen table like I have 100 times. The software chewing through the card and laying triggers into thumbnails one at a time down the screen while Skillet snored under the table by my feet. 40 of the 41 triggers were exactly what I expected by then. Brush, a doe, the cedar break. Empty grass, my own back fence sitting closer in frame than any Coldwater camera has any earthly business being. The 41st trigger is timestamped 11:58 tonight. The clock on my stove says 11:51. I've spent 5 months learning what this man does with timestamps. He sets them himself. He decides how much time to pretend has passed. I don't think this one is a mistake either. For a second, loading, I thought it was a bad file. The thumbnail came in dark and orange instead of the cold green-white of infrared. And my first actual thought, God help me, the last dumb ordinary thought I had, was that the camera's night vision had finally failed, and I'd need to note it in the report. Then it finished loading and I understood it wasn't outdoor light at all. It was my kitchen lamp. The angle is low and indoor, shot from somewhere near the baseboard behind me, aimed up and across the room the way you'd aim a camera you'd set down and not picked back up. My kitchen table is in it. The stack of manila folders at my elbow is in it, Coldwater lettered on the tab in my own blue Sharpie. And the back of a man's head, bent over a laptop, lit orange by a lamp I am sitting 14 inches away from right now, is in it. Skillet hasn't lifted his head. That's the detail I keep returning to, more than the frame itself. He's asleep under the table, same as always, and whatever moved through this house carrying something with a shutter in it, moved quietly enough, or familiarly enough, that my dog didn't so much as huff. It's 11:56 now. I haven't turned around yet. I keep telling myself I'm about to, the same way I've told myself for 2 years that I'm about to actually watch the next card the whole way through before I sign off on it. I never do. I write the easy line and I mail it back, and I let the quiet stand in for the truth because the quiet has never once cost me anything. I don't think tonight is going to be the night that changes, and that's the part I can't get past. Not that something is behind me in my own kitchen. That some tired, incurious piece of me is still sitting here, hands on the keyboard, waiting for a reason good enough to look. And that's where he leaves it. The Graveyard Slot airs twice a week, new stories in the dead hours, wherever you're hearing this. If tonight kept you company, follow the show on Spotify, subscribe on YouTube. It matters more than it should. And if something ever happened to you, something you've been carrying, something nobody believed, write it down and send it in. The address is thegraveyardslot.com. We read them as written. Until next time then, keep your porch light on, not because it helps, because it's polite to whatever's watching. This has been the Graveyard Slot. We're off the air.